Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome yet again to another live edition of What Really Matters NYC with your host, Tony Keevan, and more importantly, you. You can dial in 212-757-1541. We've got our commentator, Lorraine, on the line. Commentator Lorraine, you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. And ladies and gentlemen, we have a special guest for a short period of time here this evening at the top of our show. His name is Henry L. Grishman. He's the superintendent of the Jericho School District on Long Island. Henry, you there?
I'm here. Good evening.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. And what we wanted
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. And I know you're in the middle of another meeting, so you've stepped out to do this with us. And really, the reason that we've asked you to join us for just a little bit of time is that there's been so much going on in New York City with the schools. And we've got a school bus strike, which we'll talk about later on. But really, the teacher evaluation process seems to have gone on for at least a couple months here in New York City. And last week it caught my eye because it seems to potentially be affecting funding to New York. And so we thought we'd reach out to you because the New York Times mentioned yourself as someone who has been in the education system for decades, and you're a well-respected gentleman, and you're probably very objective. And I was asking perhaps if you could give us a little background on the subject of teacher evaluations. I've spoke to a couple teachers on it, and it seems that there's a union involved, and there's the city administration, and of course there's teachers involved, and of course there's always students involved too. And kind of coupled with the bus strike, it seems that the kids on one end bookended by the teachers or the parents on the other, and then in the middle we've got all this sort of unions and administration and all sorts of stuff that keeps impacting our kids in one way or another. And I was wondering if you could kind of elaborate just a little bit on what the teacher evaluation system is and what happened last week when I guess the negotiations came to a standstill, and give us your general opinion on the way forward on that topic, because it seems to touch a lot of New Yorkers.
Sure. In effect, legislation was passed under the direction of our governor and our commissioner of education, which in effect mandated that every school district in the state of New York develop a teacher evaluation system based upon one of several rubrics, and one that included teacher evaluation based upon a student assessment, a student growth model. So this was on the horizon just about a year ago. So again, from my perspective, we whether we liked it or didn't like it in our school district, we knew that it was a mandate that we were going to have to follow because it was a mandate, and also because there were dollars attached to the mandate and a deadline for it. So we sat down with our teacher association leadership and started working toward a mutual agreement, understanding that we had to work within certain guidelines, and whether we agreed fully with those guidelines or not, we still had to develop a system that we were comfortable with, that would meet the legislative requirement, and that would also meet our operation and our culture within our district. And we came to an agreement. It probably was in maybe November October, November of this past year.
So how does it work? Do the students evaluate the teachers, and then based on that, the teachers are graded and then either expelled from the school or not? Is that sort of?
There are several components. One of the component is it's not where a teacher where kids will say this was a good teacher or this was an effective teacher. In effect, what is developed is an accepted overall rubric first, and there are several that are research-based rubrics which go through a list of 100 observable characteristics of a teacher, dealing with planning, with classroom presentation, with interaction with the students, with participation in professional activities. So there's a rubric that you agree to, and then in addition to that, there is a measure that will come out from the state based upon student growth. from my perspective, the greatest degree of controversy has been over the reliability of that growth measure, and questions raised by researchers in terms of the validity of that part of the teacher evaluation process.
Yeah,
So
does it apply to all students, like special needs students as well?
well, right now the initial group under this legislation are students in grades 3 through 8 in English language arts and math, and then any exam where there is an endpoint exam, such as a Regents exam in English or math, there will be a growth measure as well.
Wow. So what happened that the negotiations sort of fell apart, if you're aware, in New York City last week? Because they say in the news, the New York Times was saying that it puts, I think, up to $700 million of aid for our schools in jeopardy if we don't get this plan together. I think it's in 2 weeks. And
correct. That's how I read the article as well. And based upon that article, and again, I'm not a player in New York City, but it appeared that it had something to do with the sunset language that the union was requesting.
Meaning,
sunset, typically sunset language in a teacher's contract makes some type of statement that at the conclusion of 1 year or 2 years, that provision, that agreement will sunset and will need to be renegotiated. So in effect, in Jericho, when we started to meet, we agreed early on that this was new ground, a new process, and the teachers requested, would we consider a sunset clause after 1 year so that we could sit down this coming summer, evaluate how it went, and see if it needed to be tweaked, modified, revised in any way before we put it in place again. So in Jericho, we agreed to a sunset clause with an understanding that the dialogue had been healthy all along, and we saw the notion of returning to the table for continued negotiations a year from now as making sense. My read from the New York Times article is that was not the desire of the mayor of New York.
Yeah, and I think that they had the union had suggested the sunset clause be enacted at the end of 2 years, which
Correct.
was right before the deadline of the initiation of getting rid of teachers if they weren't performing properly. So it sort of gave the union an out. And I'm wondering why they didn't do it just a year earlier like you did, so that they kind of give it a balanced view.
Yeah, and again, I also appreciate the difference in working in a district that that employs 350 teachers versus New York City. The dialogue that we have with union leadership is far different in a much smaller school district. The dynamics of the relationship between labor and management, I would define here as highly professional.
Sure, and I guess, coming from my experience in the corporate world, it's really, they devolve it way down to the managers. I mean, the manager talks to or the supervisor talks to the manager, and if you're not performing, you don't get a bonus or you don't get a raise or whatever. Why don't they do that in the school system? Why don't they just let you're in charge of the school district, and you devolve it to your headmasters and let them bonus or fire teachers as they wish? Why doesn't it work that way? It seems so much more personal and intimate and relevant to the students.
Well, I mean, obviously we are saddled with, and have been saddled with, legislation called tenure, which provides protection for teachers and administrators after a 3-year probationary period. This APPR provides a method to hasten the process of letting an unsatisfactory teacher be removed.
I see.
So that piece is part of the new legislation.
I see. And that also gets to our bus driver strike, because that also has to do with tenure and seniority, etc. It seems that's sort of, and I remember in college, tenure was something you really the professors really shot for, because once you got into that, you were pretty much set.
Correct. I mean, there is a similar tenure system that exists in the post-secondary world, and as there has been in the majority of public education as well.
So is it, I'll just keep you another minute because I know you got to go. So is the big picture that tenure is sort of going away?
There's no question, I think, in the last several years, the issue around tenure has been under attack, and I think there's a desire out there to say there needs to be a better process in place for that, whether district to district, whether that's 1% or 2% or 3% of your teachers that should not be in a classroom, that have burned out and need to be removed. And there needs to be a process in place now that's different. There's a process that's currently in place called the 30-20A, which is a proceeding to remove a tenured teacher, which is extremely costly, extremely time-consuming, and by and large an ineffective mechanism to fire a tenured teacher or administrator. Under the new legislation, there is an expedited process which appears to be, from my view, a fair one, one that will provide support for the ineffective teacher, and after a certain period of time, we'll move toward removal of that teacher if improvements are not shown.
Do you think the city's going to get it together by February 15th?
That's an interesting question. Quite a challenge based upon what appears to be the position of both sides.
Yeah, and I think we're going to lose our $700 million, and it just, in the end, who does it really hurt?
It hurts. Bottom line is it hurts the kids, and there's no way that New York City, in today's world, or any school district in today's world, can afford to lose any funding whatsoever.
I know. Gosh, I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but it just seems that our school kids keep getting hit up between, I don't want to bring it up, but Newtown and, the bus strike and now this. I mean, I wish we had some leadership that could kind of iron this out, and I guess we'll take your advice and hope for the best. I'm agree with you that a one-year review in the middle of the process seems like a more reasonable idea, and I hope they come to their senses in the next couple weeks.
For the benefit of the kids, I sincerely hope they do. In public education today, we're all living under such a financially challenging time that I know, from my perspective, every dollar is so important to provide the kids the services that they need to succeed. Starting with issues at class size, or providing support services to kids. And it's just a shame to see $700 million sitting on the table.
Lorraine, you have any quick question before Henry goes?
Well, I was just wondering if there would be any sort of peer review committee that would help the teachers not lose their jobs.
Yeah, as part of the process. And one of the things that I like, and I think our Teachers Association liked, is that whole process initially is not about firing the teacher, but it's about assessing the specific weaknesses and then providing support for the teacher to remediate those weaknesses, both by administrators and by peers. And then that process could go on for as much as 2 years with a concerted effort to improve the skills of that teacher before that teacher is terminated. And I really like the way you go into it with the notion, we're going to take this teacher as unsatisfactory and do everything we can to make that teacher an effective teacher.
Sure. Okay.
And the process is set up with an optimistic view.
Perfect. Well, listen, Henry.
It's probably cheaper to reboot that teacher than to go out and find a new one.
I'm not sure, just in terms of cost, but in terms of, somebody who's been in a system and knows a culture and knows a community, it makes sense to try and rehabilitate a teacher if you can. And if you can't, then look for a way to separate.
Okay. Well, Henry, we're going to let you go because we know you got other things to do, and we want to thank you very much for joining us and explaining that to New York City, all right?
My pleasure.
Yes, sir. Take care. Thank you again.
You have a good evening.
Yes, sir.
Bye-bye.